Thank you for joining us and good afternoon. I'm your host, Dave Hiltz, and we have a busy 60 minutes ahead of us, so let's get started. This live webcast is brought to you and made possible in part through the generous financial support of the Citizens CPR Foundation by these organizations. You can learn more about our supporters by visiting us at citizenscpr.org. You know, sudden cardiac arrest continues to be a major public health issue, one that requires intensive planning, collaboration, and implementation at all levels. As members of the global resuscitation community, we recognize the critical need for collaboration in all that we do as we collectively work towards the unified goal of saving lives. We value all of your contributions to improving resuscitation outcomes, and thank you for being part of our life-saving mission. We have a few announcements for you today. For your first announcement, the Citizens CPR Foundation's Cardiac Arrest Survival Summit is returning once again to the great city of San Diego from November 29th through December 2nd, 2023. So mark your calendars and prepare your teams. Please stay tuned for more details, and we look forward to seeing you there. Our peers at the Resuscitation Academy continue conducting extraordinary webinars that occur the third Thursday of every month at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hosted by Dr. Tom Ray, these are exceptional and not to be missed. Please look for information specific to these monthly calls in your post-webinar communication from us. Last week, ILCOR released the consensus on cardiopulmonary resuscitation and emergency cardiovascular care science with treatment recommendations. This summary addresses the most recently published resuscitation evidence. We remain confident that science, combined with educational efficiency and implementation, will help save more lives. Information regarding the 2022 consensus statement will also be included in your post-program messaging to you. Please look for it. Your questions and feedback during this webcast are very important. Please use the chat feature to present your questions and your feedback. Your input will help improve the program experience for all. And now, on to our featured discussion and our very special guest. With us this afternoon is Tony Walker, joining us live from Australia. Tony is the Chief Executive Officer of Ambulance Victoria and a registered paramedic with over 36 years of experience. Over the past 6 years, Tony has been part of significant transformation at Ambulance Victoria to improve the response they provide to sudden cardiac arrest. Ambulance Victoria is an excellent example to other systems, and Tony is an accomplished leader and a champion of champions. Welcome, Tony, and good morning to you.
Morning, Dave, and well, good morning, everyone. It's bright and early over here in Australia this morning.
And we're so glad that you're here. We salute you with our virtual cup of coffee. So, Tony, you know, welcome back to the program, and it's always just so delightful to see you. Now, you've been involved in out-of-hospital cardiac arrest care for some time. Nearly 4 decades by my math. So I'm going to ask a couple of really decent questions here. And by the way, everyone knows that these are unrehearsed. So I am looking forward to the responses just as much as everyone else. So tell me, what was your motivation for entering a career with the ambulance service? And to that end, was there a single event in your life that attracted you to this calling?
Well, it's an interesting question, Dave. I started my working career actually as an operating theatre technician, working in hospitals, and so I was spending a lot of time with anaesthetists, getting to see obviously surgery and things going on, helping support that work. But it was at the hospital I was working at, there was an intensive care paramedic unit that operated out of that hospital. And I would often, occasionally, they would bring patients in directly from the field into the operating theatre, severe patients, ruptured aortic aneurysms, things like that. And you would, and I got to see them work, and that calm demeanour and the work they were doing. And it was a thing that probably motivated me to go, that looks like a pretty interesting career. That looks like something that would be, amazing to be involved with. And that was probably the catalyst for me to go through the journey of applying on multiple occasions, as you did back then, to various ambulance services, and eventually got in 1986 into Ambulance Victoria at the time.
Oh, that's really interesting, and oddly enough, a little bit of a parallel to my own experience and my draw to working in the ambulance service began in a hospital setting myself, and was oriented to working in the accident room, or it was newly renamed, an emergency department. And I found that the work that the EMS agencies were doing to be of profound interest. So we're not old, Tony, we're just chronologically challenged. So brace yourself for the next image that I'm going to pull up with a question for you. So now we've all had experiences with our first CPR training program. And this is a photo from a popular news program in the United States, probably dating to the late 70s. So maybe a little bit before you and I took our first CPR course. But I'm wondering if the mannequin looks similar, right? A recording Resuscitation mannequin. So if you wouldn't mind indulging us, please tell us a little bit about your first CPR training course, if you wouldn't mind.
Absolutely. And I've got to say, I reckon it was on a mannequin exactly like that, Dave. It was around 1982, I think I probably started my first CPR course. And it was with St John Ambulance, who are a provider of first aid services widely across Australia. And back then were probably one of essentially was a duopoly of themselves and the Red Cross here in Australia providing those services. So I did my first aid course and CPR course with St John back in 1982, and it was a very different time in some ways, because it was all about the numbers. It was all about the absolute get it right. There was no variance at all, versus the move over the last few decades to be any resuscitation is better than none. So it was a very rigorous and challenging program to make sure you got it right. But I've got to say, you walked away from that absolutely holding those skills, and that mannequin brings back a lot of memories.
Doesn't it? And it's interesting to me, anyhow, that history repeats itself, right? And so, if I recall correctly, and I think I'm probably in the right zip code, right ballpark, right area, I seem to remember some classroom time, but the vast majority of time was spent working on the mannequin.
Mm.
And do I dare say I recall something about staircase ventilations?
Mm.
But you had to have a perfect strip
Mm.
in order to get your credential.
Correct.
And, and then we moved kind of away. I believe
Mm.
that, if we rolled the clock back to, the beginnings of resuscitation education, the idea was competency
Mm.
rather than compliance.
Mm.
And I think maybe due to blameless circumstances, we may have lost our way and gotten too um, too focused on compliance rather than the real goal,
Mm.
which is to have knowledgeable individuals with competent
Mm.
skills. So very interesting. Let's carry on. Now, you've spent the last 6 years, prior to your departure from Ambulance Victoria, in a leadership role.
Mm.
But can you tell us a little bit? You didn't just jump in and become a leader, right? There had to be a pathway, a series of events that occurred that led you into the leadership role. So, could you tell us a little bit about some various roles that
Mm.
you had at Ambulance Victoria, please, sir?
Yeah, certainly, Dave. So I started off on road as an ambulance officer back in 1986, and back then we did a 3-year training program, in-house training program, with some classroom time, and essentially working with the preceptor to ensure you're able to do the job. I moved on from that after a few years to become do the intensive care paramedic program, and Victoria is one of, I think, the third city in the world after Seattle and Ireland to actually have implemented an intensive care paramedic program. So I was successful onto that and did that for a number of years, and then moved into a rural town or regional town to help roll out that program more broadly across country Victoria, and then moved into education. So my passion was education, both in teaching in the community. I did a lot of community-based teaching in CPR and first aid, and teaching our paramedics and first responders as part of their role. So did that for a number of years, and then moved into senior clinical manager roles, so responsible for the clinical services of the rural service at that time. There were multiple services in those days in Victoria. Moved into an executive role in education and quality and clinical care, which I did for a number of years. And I probably had this realization back in around 2009 that as much as I loved education, and it's a passion for me, and still is a passion for me today, I realized that if I wanted to shift the dial on some areas of improving clinical care and the service I was working in, I had to move into operations. So it was a pretty big leap. I jumped across from an executive role in clinical services to heading up operations for Ambulance Victoria. And that was a baptism of fire, as you can appreciate. It was, you're moving into the cut and thrust of the delivery of the service every day, and did that for a number of years. And fortuitously was asked to step in about 8 years ago into the acting CEO role, and my predecessor left, and then about 18 months after that was successful in obtaining the role on an ongoing basis. So it's been interesting, and I'm often asked by new graduates and others, how'd you get there? And I reflected on that, and I think the one thing I've always done across my career is I've never said no. I've never said, and my wife says I probably should say it more than I do, but I've never said no. I've never said, someone offers me an opportunity, I'll give it a go, I'll give it a chance. And I've learned stuff about myself. I create networks, and I've decided I like things or don't like things. But whenever anyone's offered me an opportunity, I've always said yes and given it a go and learned something about myself, developed new skills, and developed new networks, which have helped me as we go forward.
Tony, in our preparation call, I said, don't answer any of these questions. I want to hear it fresh, the day of the live webinar today. And, it's striking how delighted I am to hear some of the things that you're saying, like an inability to say no. I think I think that is perhaps a common trait amongst advocate champions, is
Mm,
that we have a difficulty in saying no. We're always chasing force multiplication, right?
mm,
How
mm,
can we how can we have a bigger impact? And if I
mm,
reflect on my own experience, which I think matches
mm,
yours, at least to a certain extent, there was reward as an independent provider of
mm,
clinical care. And then it was, well, we can have a greater impact if
mm,
we help prepare others to provide high quality and compassionate care, right? And then you take this step towards education, and then you go, well, this is good. I'm definitely getting some force multiplication going on
mm,
here, but you know, a lack of satisfaction, right?
mm.
And needing
Yep.
to up the ante even further and move into leadership
Mm,
roles. But then beyond that, realize that our ability to accomplish this very ambitious mission requires enlisting and marshaling help from even more
mm,
individuals. And so we did not talk about this in advance, but I'm going to ask the
mm,
question, and we can
mm,
either sit on it or we can
mm,
move on. But I recall there was a true giant of resuscitation that hailed from Western Australia, who at
mm,
one point in time was the chair of ILCOR,
mm,
and his
mm,
name was Ian Jacobs.
mm,
Did you ever have any experience to be influenced or work with
mm.
Dr. Jacobs by any chance, Tony?
I did. I did. I sat on the Resuscitation Council for 15 years, and I headed up the Advanced Life Support, or deputy chair of the Advanced Life Support committee of the Resus Council, and so I worked with Ian closely. So he's a friend, actually, and deeply, deeply impacted, as many of us were when he passed.
Yeah.
But no, Ian was great. In fact, it was interesting packing up my office the other day. As you mentioned, I've recently stepped down from my role as CEO of Ambulance Victoria. Up on my shelf is a picture of Ian, actually there, sitting there on the shelf, to remind me of exactly what you're describing. He was a giant of a man who made such a profound impact on resuscitation practice, and did it with a passion. I mean, he was the sort of person who would be out there working on road. In fact, he sadly passed while actually on shift,
Yeah.
actually out working on shift. And so, just reflected, he was a giant of a man, a great friend, and we're a better resuscitation community for his input over time. So no, he was a dear friend, and did have a significant influence on me over time, particularly in that evidence-based pace. Where he was constantly pushing and challenging things like epinephrine use, for example,
Right.
things like that. He was going places others would, angels would fear to tread, and, and he did it
Yeah.
brilliantly.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I apologize for kind of the surprise there, but
No worries, not at all.
there was part of me that was starting to think about, I wonder, because, unlike you, I only had the opportunity to work with Ian, on one occasion,
Mm,
when for some reason I found myself in New Zealand sharing a keynote at a meeting there on resuscitation. I happened to meet Ian and his lovely wife, and I
mm,
was struck immediately by not only his knowledge, but also his passion and his grace. Right?
mm,
He was phenomenal, and I think
mm,
much in line with our conversation today. We have to be mindful of those fantastic
mm,
pioneers who came before us. And, we continue to stand on their shoulders
mm,
today. And Dr. Ian Jacobs, may he rest in peace, is certainly, among many who had a significant
mm,
impact on me, particularly in the area of passion and resilient efforts to improve outcomes. So thank you for sharing that with us. So let's see here. My slides may have gotten jumbled up a little bit here, but let's see. All right. So tell us, what was kind of the first tipping point at Ambulance Victoria when kind of it became, this is a real deal, we need to do something to improve resuscitation outcomes? What was that tipping point, or what were the factors that kind of launched Ambulance Victoria into, a sustained campaign to improve outcomes?
It's a really interesting question, Dave, and I see myself as a child of the sort of the resuscitation era in some ways. I came into Ambulance Victoria at a time that there were 8 intensive care units in Melbourne carrying defibrillators. That was it. And so, if you did a cardiac arrest, you called for an intensive care paramedic vehicle. They'd come along and, weave their magic and do some amazing things. And the ambulance service at the time recognised that to improve outcomes, we needed to have defibrillation across the board. So they implemented a statewide defibrillation program for all ambulance officers and paramedics across the state, using the old Hewlett-Packard defibrillator, as my colleagues affectionately call it, the boat anchor. It was this heavy, big thing we carried around, but it did the job. And it was so that was probably the big point of having this widespread defibrillation come through around the state. But I have to say, it's probably it was probably, interestingly, the point that came after we rolled all that out, that there was this reflective piece of, you see good outcomes, you hear the great stories of people whose lives have been saved. And our medical director, Professor Steve Bernard, at the time did a review to see, well, okay, what's the evidence telling us? Are we making a difference? And we were pretty shocked to find out that despite all this investment, all the work we were doing, we were seeing a 10% survival to hospital and 3% discharge. And it was the wake-up call for us as an ambulance service to go, what's wrong? We've just put defibrillators on all these vehicles. We're doing all this work. We're doing some community training, all these things, but we're not seeing the outcomes we expected. And that was the piece. That was the piece for us that all of a sudden said that we need to do something different, that we need to actually take a good look at why that's the case. And largely it was because we weren't getting that defibrillator to our people quickly enough, to the patients quickly enough. There were not enough people out in the community doing CPR on these patients. And that for us became the catalyst for what we, and at the time, convinced government to invest in a pre-ambulance basic life support program, which back in the late 1990s it started. And it was phenomenal. It was a government prepared to invest $3 million a year, protected funding. So, and all listeners know, money comes into organisations and there's lots of priorities that have to be done. The government said this money can only be used to improve cardiac arrest outcomes. And it was a recurrent $3 million per annum budget, and it led to us doing some quite amazing things in both data registries. We rolled out. In fact, I'm still amazed. 20 plus years on, we are the only ambulance service in Australia who uses firefighter first co-responders. I find it phenomenal that it is not a national program. But that's, we engaged our firefighter colleagues. Best thing we ever did. They work side by side with us. They get there early. They get there with us. They work as part of a team. So it was that type of systemization and building the system that helped us with data and a registry that helped us have the data to know what was actually going on to help us then drive improvement. So lots of steps along the way, but that was that point when we took a good look at ourselves and realized we were not as good as we thought we were. We're probably drinking our own bathwater a little bit, and it was time to actually get on and make a difference.
Yeah. Again, despite the geographic distance between myself and you and many on the call, again, this is sounding very familiar. And although I think it was just yesterday, I guess it really wasn't just yesterday, but the 1990s were fairly transformative for myself and many others, where previously, when I had undertaken my initial paramedic education, the idea was that mobile intensive care units were the magic bullet to help save lives. And although I was even more naive then than I am now, I remember thinking like, geez, this isn't working out the way that I had hoped and anticipated. And again, those late 1990s became very transformative for me. And, I have to give a shout out to the Citizen CPR Foundation because I attended my first emergency cardiovascular care update conference in 1998. And from that, I left with kind of a host of implementable ideas to help improve outcomes. And that was clearly, citizen CPR education was something that was significantly lacking. The concept of first responder defibrillation, not only to include our peers from the fire service, but also law enforcement, was terribly underleveraged. And further to that, early identification, head them off at the pass kind of strategies, and then pre-hospital 12-lead ECGs. So clearly, it sounds like we all started kind of thinking about a systematic approach that improved community-based strategies to help improve outcomes. So thank you for the insights in that regard. So, the wisdom of learning from failure is incontrovertible, right? And yet organizations that do it well are regretfully extraordinarily rare. So can you tell us about any strategies that turned out to be failures? I know this is hard, but what strategies may have turned out to be failures, and how did Ambulance Victoria and you and your peers essentially turn those failures into something positive? This could be a tough one.
No, it's a very good question, and it is. If I reflect back, I'd probably go back to what I mentioned before. This huge investment by us and government to put defibrillators on every ambulance, and without actually understanding the need to build a system around that. So it's the defibrillator is not the panacea. It's not the solution in its own right. And I think that was probably the shift for us, that we rolled out defibrillation. We put defibrillation on all our ambulances, and had this sense that this would fix cardiac arrest issues, when we know that actually it's a much more complex beast than that. So once we understood that, this sort of pivotal piece, I often describe it, this is a short paper done in emergency medicine here in Australia magazine by Professor Bernard, and a very, very powerful editorial by another expert here in Australia, another wonderful emergency physician, Professor Peter Cameron, who challenged us to say, it's not working. It looks good and you're getting some lives saved, but it's not working. We must build a system built around the chain of survival. And that was it, because we didn't talk about the chain of survival in broad terms. We talked about defibrillation. We talked about cardiac arrest. We didn't have a systematic linked up CPR program in the community. We didn't measure it. So we didn't know it. You don't measure it, you can't improve it. And so, that was very much the point for us, where we actually were prepared to say, well, we've done all this work and it should make a difference. This is why it's not. Okay, what do we do next? And how do we actually take that as a true system of care, and built on the chain of survival? How do we strengthen that chain of survival in an ongoing way across Victoria. So I think that in some ways it was one of our greatest successes and our greatest failures, Dave. It was putting in defibrillation, big tick on every vehicle. Great, one of the first ambulance services, sort of statewide provincial ambulance service to do this, but actually it wasn't giving us the outcomes anyone expected, and we're prepared to put our hand up and say, okay, what do we do next?
Huh. Yeah, failures. Thank you again. And it's hard to admit failure, and but then to use it is a fantastic feat, right? And so, good Lord, I'm recalling a few things as we're chatting here. We measured success erroneously and often with a number of interventions that were provided, right? How many IVs were established? Was the patient intubated? Was neurogastric tube placed? How many meds were administered? High dose epinephrine, good gosh. Just, theophylline for asystole. I mean, there were just so many wrong turns that I think were, the attraction may have been kind of bright, shiny new things, magic bullets, rather than kind of rolling up your sleeves, getting to the hard work of measuring what's truly important and what's not, leaving it behind. So very interesting. And I believe that kind of leads us to our next question. And that would be, how about some really big successes? What strategy or strategies delivered results that, how shall we say, went well beyond the ambitious expectations?
Well, I have to say there's a term I use a little bit, and it applies absolutely in cardiac arrest, and it's called radical transparency, Dave. It's to put your money where your mouth is. So one of the most powerful thing we ever did was to start publishing all of our data. Every year we publish an annual report that provides a complete breakdown of our cardiac arrest outcomes, what's driving it, benchmarking, areas of improvement. And so that becomes that. So therefore, the community who are funding you at the end of the day and purchasing your services get to understand the difference you're making. And when you do that, and you look at your colleagues in Seattle and you look at your colleagues elsewhere and go, well, how do we get there? And so then it became a recognition that one, we have to have a registry, and that's the most with the radical transparency of an annual report. The registry, which now has over 100,000 cardiac arrest cases, it's one of the largest in the world. It's been operating for over 20 years, and I have to pay credit to Professor Karen Smith, who was the lead in establishing that piece of work. That became the powerhouse to then do research to identify the rollout of AEDs into places like our airports, and built on the O'Hare work and O'Hare Airport work, and realizing actually we can do this. And then all of a sudden, again, there's this thread that comes through, Dave, of technology. As technology changes, you mentioned it before, around 12 leads and things like that. As technology changes, then that enables us to do different things. So the introduction of automated external defibrillators allowed us to put them across the airport and major railway stations, places the registry told us were high-risk cardiac arrest locations. So not just where we think they're good, but where the data told us they should go. And that then made a huge difference to creating a starting concept of public access defibrillation in Victoria. Lots of research. We've tried lots of different things. We've been out there with we tried pre-hospital cooling, didn't make a difference, but we gave it a go, published it. And our philosophy is, we will publish all of our research. If the research isn't there, we'll do it and we will publish it to help support the peer-reviewed programs across the world, so others can look from our successes and failures. So those type of activities have been really quite powerful, in particularly around the registry and how do we get defibrillation and CPR to someone more quickly. And I think one of the things that I look at as a legacy piece for me in the last few years has been the implementation of Good Sam, which was now going back to our roots and getting community connected to cardiac arrest as responders, using technology as a thread coming through again. So new technology enables us to actually almost take us back to our roots of how we established as a service in connecting the community to someone in need with the technology to help them make a difference.
Empowering the citizens, right, is certainly a big piece of this, because we need them to act. We need their support. We need them in so many different ways. I'm the term radical transparency, that is just resonating with me in a very big way, Tony. And as you know, I have always pointed to Ambulance Victoria's example of what every EMS system should be like when it comes to radical transparency. And it's easier said than done, right? I think it's got to be hard for an ambulance service whose very name and being is associated with life saving. And now we're kind of asking to come clean with the public that's being served and saying, maybe we're not doing as well with this as we possibly could be. And, the insertion of data-driven strategies and that quality improvement cycle, and its association with the radical transparency is extraordinary. And I would have to say, yeah, that makes all the sense in the world, that this was your biggest success, is that transparency and its association with the data-driven strategies and really all that you do. So this is great. Thank you. Let's move on and let's look at another question here. So now it appears that there is a profound culture of excellence when it comes to improving cardiac arrest outcomes in Ambulance Victoria. And culture, I've been looking for a formula out there that is like, take it from here, put it over here, water it, feed it, and watch it grow. I haven't been able to find that yet. So would you be able to provide some insights onto how this occurred within Ambulance Victoria? Because I'm certain it didn't happen by accident. There had to be some kind of pathway for that. And what were the greatest influencing and driving factors creating this culture?
Yep. So I think the first part of it was you can't unsee what you see. So once you have the data in front of you about how you're performing, you have a line in the sand. You know where you are. It's okay. And the biggest fear people have is the political issues of releasing that. The community and governments, in my experience, are very generous where you have a plan to get it better. So here's the line here, and don't just accept it, saying, and here's our plan to improve it. So for us, it was the data to tell us where we were, and then a plan to say, how do we continue to improve this? And at an organisational level, it's built up, from my experience, certainly in Ambulance Victoria, it's built up around areas such as a philosophical approach. So the principle being, well, every person in VF should survive. Technically, if you're in VF and if you're in an optimized system, you should survive. I know that's a pretty broad statement, but in principle, that can drive you thinking differently. And ask your questions, well, why didn't that person survive? What was it made it? Was it CPR? Was it no telecommunicator CPR prior to getting? All those things can help improve your service. I think the other big thing for us was this philosophy of measure and improve. The principle of not being satisfied. And I've got to say, we're a competitive lot in our EMS systems, and that's okay. If competition is used in the right way, we look at Seattle as the penultimate system as an organisation and say, how do we get there? Because we should be able to, because we're not that much different. So what are they doing well when it comes to the work, as you mentioned earlier, the Resuscitation Academy and others going, okay, it's built into their DNA, the way they look at these things, improve it, test, challenge, and improve. And that's been the thing for us. What's next? How do you do something next to improve what's going to make a difference? Because once you optimize a lot of the low-hanging fruit, then some of this stuff is hard. But it's about saying, you've got to challenge and test the way you look at things. When you might have a workforce that would go, well, we love that new bright and shiny piece of equipment. Well, actually, to be honest, that money will actually make a better difference if we invested in the front end at community-based work around community defibrillation and CPR. And I've got to give credit to our workforce, Ambulance Victoria's workforce. They recognise that. They recognise that they're only as good as what the person did before they got there. And so it's in everyone's interest to have that working well, because then they can do what they do well. Our health services can do what they do well. Because that was the other big challenge for us. We saw that, people do better at different hospitals, because the registry actually looks at patient discharge to 12 months follow-up. And so it then changed the way where we took people. That challenges some of our health service colleagues when you go, we're going to bypass your hospital because actually our patients do better on an evidence base to go to these other health facilities. Our helicopters now, which were mainly for trauma, are now picking up cardiac arrest patients and stroke patients and taking them to centres of excellence. The system is evolving constantly to say, well, okay, what's next? How do we improve that? Because it's not just about, that's the other thing, Dave, I think it's not just measuring whether you get someone to hospital with a pulse. Because to be brutally honest with you, that's not an outcome measure. For an outcome measure for me is, has that person gone home? And ideally, what's their quality of life? Are they going back, returning to work? And this brings in this whole issue of survivorship now. And, as we've seen with a lot of diseases in our community, people are living post-cardiac arrest, their families, people are thriving, but they're also dealing with a whole lot of other issues around survivorship. So how do we support them going forward as well, which I know is a really emerging piece now, which is an incredibly gratifying thing to think. We're now focusing on the survivorship piece of the patients we've saved, not just the getting them to hospital with a pulse. It's about quality of life. And we know in Victoria, 75% of people who are working prior to their cardiac arrest are back at work 12 months later. So that's a powerful piece when you're having a chat to government about investing.
Wow. Repatriating the patient to their families, to their communities, to their employers. This is serious, right? And you talk about point of entry, right? Patient destinations. I'm still feeling a few lumps from some of that, right? What do you mean you're bypassing the closest institution to take the patient to a center of excellence? These were, and do I dare say, they are difficult pills to swallow. This is not easy. I hear also kind of this bias for action, right? Let's do something. Right. But let's not just be willy-nilly about it, but let's be purposeful in carrying out a particular strategy and measuring it and seeing if it's actually had an impact. Competition. It's very interesting. Again, I talk to leaders and advocates from all over the United States and beyond, and just about all of them have ambitions related to improving outcomes, and it's nice to have those conversations. But then when you ask, boy, that's great, and you say, what's your plan? that's when, they go, oh gosh, Dave, look at the time. It's been really great talking with you, but I gotta go, right? And it's like ambition without a plan is like a rudderless ship on the ocean. You're just not gonna get anywhere. So yeah, I'm looking forward to learning more about this culture development thing because I think we've got a fair amount to learn in that regard. So let's see what my slides have gotten a little bit jumbled today. So let's see what the next one brings for a surprise, if I can get it to advance at all. Oh, there we go. Hold on. Yep, that was the last one. So here we go. Sorry, everyone, for the technical glitches, but here's a good one for you. Now, we're always looking to the future with hope and excitement, right? Hope for new science, new technologies, and better implementation. So we're going to ask you to take out your tea leaves or your magic 8-ball or whatever your equivalent is, Tony, and give us, what are the Tony Walker predictions for resuscitation in the future?
So for me, it's back to basics. As much as my whole career, I've constantly looking at how do we advance the next big thing we put in. If I look to where I think that the next say 10 years is, it's about technology and about connection. So if I look at in Victoria, I know that if you're defibrillated by a public access defibrillator, you have a 70% chance of going home. If you're defibrillated by a public access defibrillator at Melbourne Airport, you've got a 95% chance of going home. And so it's all about time to defibrillation and time to CPR. And so I think the next period of time, next 10 years, for example, will be how do you systemize that? And technology allows us to do it now. So I look at the introduction here in Victoria of GoodSam, similar to Pulse Points and other great Pulse Point, brilliant platform. I know it's widely used across the United States as well. But those platforms essentially allow you to crowdsource CPR and defibrillation. And it often takes away the need for the ambulance service or the EMS service to have to own everything. So if you build a system that says you can, on your mobile phone, download an app and be connected to a patient in need, and here's your nearest defibrillator, then that basically, the more people, and we see this in Denmark, for example, you get 100,000, 200,000 people signed up to those tools. Then you've got an army of community responders ready to go out there to make a difference in a way that was never possible because that technology didn't exist, say, 10 years ago. So that's the first piece. And you can then hang off that. All different organisations focus on different things. So it doesn't have to be all under the domain of the EMS service. Organisations, communities can say, I want to make my community heart safe. How do I go about doing that? Well, fundamentally, one element of that is connecting it up to the dispatch system of the ambulance service and the EMS service. So that's a really important piece for me. The second piece for me that I'm incredibly excited about now is the miniaturization of defibrillation. We've got CellAid that's now out there, which is essentially about the size of the large mobile phone that is actually being used out in the community now for that people can carry around as a single-use AED. When Ambulance Victoria and St John, New Zealand are actually doing a first trial where GoodSam responders in those two jurisdictions will have access to the CellAid to actually see what difference it can make. Heart Hero is another great example of that. Now, so this miniaturizing, relatively inexpensive technology means that more and more people can have defibrillators. So more and more community responders, all carrying defibrillators, gives you, equals, from my point of view, a formula that says this is going to increase survival, because we know from our work in Victoria, 70% public access defibrillation survive. If you can get that responder there in a couple of minutes to defibrillate someone and start CPR, then we know we'll start seeing the improved outcomes. So we also know 75% of cardiac arrests occur in the home. So again, how do you get that home-based concept of someone having access to a defibrillator? So I think we're moving almost beyond the days of having to have a defibrillator hanging up on the wall of the local sports centre. I don't think that'll go away completely, to one where we, in the next 10 years, we're going to have defibrillators that anyone can afford, that they can carry. They can connect up to an app and be alerted to their neighbour or anyone else around them who needs that care. And you don't have to go hunting for a defibrillator. You've got it in your bag. You've got it in your pocket. So I think that they're the big things in the next period of time, and a complete recognition that it is a system of care. That you, at the end of the day, it takes a system to save a life. And I think if I look at the work coming out of the Global Resus, the Global Resus Alliance and the Resus Academy, the formula's there. It's not what people want to see, because that's hard stuff, but the formula's there to take it forward. So it'll be the front ending of the chain of survival. Not all links are equal, and the use of technology to connect to the community and the goodwill that sits out there to help your fellow man and woman.
Outstanding and sage advice, and a vision for the future. I will say that futuristic drone ambulances like in this image are going to challenge us.
They will.
Because certainly this has how shall I say, greater sex appeal than some of that harder to do community work and empowering the citizens to set the table for the rest of us. And for professional providers doing an exceptional job and providing high quality resuscitative care, that's a big thing that will always remain a constant. But I really do agree with you that looking at empowering the citizens and the community and creating a system that involves them is definitely the direction to go in. So really appreciate that. Tony, this has been a fantastic discussion, and I'm delighted that you have agreed to join our advisory group to help communities achieve greater successes. But before we move on to any questions from our fellow advocate champions, do you have a couple of words of advice for people like us? Because some days are harder than others.
It will be hard, and all good things are hard. But there is no doubt that it's having a sense of we can improve what we're doing, and it doesn't have to be it's a single steps that make a difference. It doesn't have to be the big $100 million investment. It can be the simple steps that you implement around community-based programs. Measuring the performance of your own EMS providers in the work that they're doing, in looking at high performance CPR, those types of things are not as, they're not as sexy sometimes, but we know the evidence proves it. And I think for me, if I look back now, over my last nearly 40 years in the EMS environment, the thing that stands out to me over the last few years has been the simplicity. Although it was never simple to get there, the simplicity and the absolute clarity that comes out of the Resuscitation Academy's work and the GRA's 10 steps. For me, that's it. That's the formula. If you get those things right and you optimize those things, you will improve cardiac arrest outcomes in your community. There are cities all around the world, and many across the United States, that have applied that work of the Resuscitation Academy, and they've shown that they're better than they were yesterday, and they'll be better tomorrow for the work they're doing. And it's this constant measure and improve, and it doesn't have to be the big hit. It just needs to be, what are we going to do next within what we can afford to do? And a lot of that is around doing what we do better every day.
Outstanding. And I couldn't agree more. Every community has the wherewithal and the opportunity to improve outcomes. I think we often collectively underestimate the resources that are available in any given community. We just assume, oh, this comes with an enormous price tag. We're just a small community. We can't do this like a big community. Meanwhile, the big communities are saying we're too big. We can't do it because we're big. So we can't do it because we're too big. We can't do it because we're too small. I think oftentimes what's lacking is that bias for action, and that let's do something, right? And is there a plan? And the Resuscitation Academy has an excellent plan, but it's all in that implementation. I don't think we've gotten any questions. We did have some comments from Paul Morris. Paul, thank you. As always, I understand you do have a plan. Paul is, like you, Tony, a big advocate of Pulse Point and the crowdsourcing approach, enabling and empowering the citizens. But we don't have any questions. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move to closing remarks because we're coming up on the hour. And so, Tony, again, on behalf of the Citizen CPR Foundation and all of our friends in the resuscitation community, I wanted to thank you, heartfelt thanks for sharing your perspective on resuscitation practices and outcomes in Victoria. I want to congratulate you on your turning the page in the next chapter of your life. And we're delighted that you're going to stick around with us and help us to help other communities. I found the conversation to be informative and inspiring. So thank you again. I am David Hiltz, and on behalf of Citizen CPR Foundation, thank you all for joining us and have a great evening.